The Saturday afternoon sun was beating down on East London as Tommy walked out of his flat, already feeling restless. At 28 years old, he had built quite a reputation in his neighborhood. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders and arms covered in tattoos, he was the kind of guy people crossed the street to avoid. His reputation wasn't something he was ashamed of either. In fact, he wore it like a badge of honor. Tommy had been working construction for over 10 years, but today was his day off. He had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. No early morning alarms, no boss yelling at him, and most importantly, no one telling him what to do. He had plans to meet up with his mates at their usual spot, grab a few drinks, and see what kind of trouble they could get into. Walking down the familiar streets of his neighborhood, Tommy felt like he owned the place. Kids playing football moved out of his way without him even asking. Shop owners gave him nervous nods as he passed by their windows. This was his territory, and everyone knew it. The thing about Tommy was that he had never really learned how to back down from a fight. Growing up in a rough part of London, he had quickly figured out that being tough was the only way to survive. His dad had left when he was just 8 years old, and his mom had worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Tommy had learned to take care of himself from a very young age. By the time he was in secondary school, Tommy was already known as someone you didn't mess with. He wasn't particularly smart in the classroom, but he was smart enough to know that respect came from being feared. If someone looked at him wrong, he would make sure they regretted it. If someone said something he didn't like, well, they usually ended up with a black eye or worse. His reputation had only grown stronger over the years. In the pubs around his area, people would point him out to their friends. Stories about his fights had become local legends, each one getting bigger and more dramatic with every telling. Tommy loved hearing these stories, even when they weren't completely true. As he turned the corner toward the pub where he was meeting his friends, Tommy thought about his week. Work had been particularly annoying. His new supervisor was some young guy fresh out of university who thought he knew everything about construction just because he had a degree. The kid had been trying to tell Tommy how to do his job, which was laughable considering Tommy had been swinging a hammer since before this supervisor had even started shaving. Just yesterday, the supervisor had made the mistake of raising his voice at Tommy in front of the whole crew. Tommy had very calmly walked over to the young man, looked him straight in the eye, and told him exactly what would happen if he ever spoke to him like that again. The supervisor had gone pale and hadn't said another word to Tommy for the rest of the day. Word had spread quickly around the construction site about what had happened. Tommy smiled, thinking about it. He had a way of handling people that just worked. No need for long conversations or explanations. Just a look, maybe a few words, and people understood exactly where they stood with him. The pub was already busy when Tommy arrived. It was one of those old London pubs that had been around for decades, with dark wood panels and the smell of beer that seemed to be permanently soaked into the walls. This wasn't the kind of place tourists usually found their way into. It was strictly for locals, and Tommy had been drinking here since he was old enough to get served. His friends were already at their usual table in the corner. There was Dave, a plumber who had known Tommy since they were kids and had seen plenty of his fights over the years. Next to him sat Jake, who worked at a nearby garage and always had grease under his fingernails. The third member of their group was Ben, who had been Tommy's neighbor for years and had become something like his biggest fan. "There he is," Dave called out as Tommy approached their table. "We were just talking about what happened with your supervisor yesterday. Ben heard about it from someone who works with your crew." Tommy sat down and grabbed the pint that Dave had already ordered for him. "Yeah, well, some people need to learn their place," he said, taking a long drink. "Can't have some university boy thinking he can push me around just because he's got a fancy title." The friends spent the next hour drinking and sharing stories. Ben was particularly excited to tell Tommy about a fight he had witnessed outside a club the previous weekend. According to Ben, some guy had been bothering a group of girls, and when someone tried to step in, things got physical. Ben described the fight in great detail, making it sound like something out of an action movie. "You should have been there, Tommy," Ben said, his eyes lighting up. "The way this guy handled himself, it reminded me of how you dealt with that bloke." outside the Chippy last month. Tommy nodded, remembering the incident. Some drunk had been causing trouble, bothering customers and making a mess. Tommy had simply walked over, grabbed the man by his shirt and escorted him out onto the street. One quick conversation later and the problem was solved. The drunk had apologized, picked himself up, and walked away. The whole thing had taken maybe 3 minutes. As the afternoon went on and the drinks kept flowing, Tommy started feeling that familiar itch for excitement. Sitting in the pub telling old stories was fine for a while, but he was looking for something more interesting. He wanted to remind himself why people in this neighborhood respected him. He wanted to feel that rush that came from being in control of a situation. "You know what?" Tommy said, finishing his 4th pint. "I'm getting bored just sitting here. Let's go find something to do." Dave raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" Tommy shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe take a walk, see what's happening around town. It's a nice day, and I'm tired of being cooped up in here." Jake looked a bit nervous. He had seen Tommy in this mood before, and it usually meant someone was going to have a very bad day. "Maybe we should just order some food and watch the match on telly," he suggested. But Tommy was already standing up, clearly done with the conversation. When Tommy made up his mind about something, there was no changing it. His friends had learned this lesson many times over the years. "Come on," Tommy said, pulling on his jacket. "Live a little. What's the worst that could happen?" Ben immediately jumped up, eager to follow Tommy wherever he was going. Dave and Jake exchanged a look, but eventually got up as well. They had been friends with Tommy long enough to know that trying to talk him out of something, once he had decided, was pointless. As they walked out of the pub into the bright afternoon sunlight, Tommy felt energized. The drinks had given him confidence, and the warm weather put him in a good mood. He didn't have any specific plan in mind, but he knew something interesting would come up. It always did when he was in this kind of mood. They started walking toward the center of London with no particular destination in mind. Tommy was in the lead, as usual, with his friends following a few steps behind. People on the street seemed to sense something about Tommy's energy today. They moved out of his way more quickly than usual, and several people looked back after he passed them. "Where are we going?" Dave asked after they had been walking for about 20 minutes. Tommy turned around and grinned. "I thought we might head toward Westminster. See the sights, maybe have a laugh with some tourists." Jake knew exactly what Tommy meant by have a laugh with some tourists. It usually involved Tommy picking on someone who looked like an easy target, maybe scaring them a bit for his own entertainment. Jake didn't particularly enjoy these situations, but he also knew better than to try to stop Tommy when he was in this kind of mood. As they got closer to the tourist areas, the streets became more crowded. There were families taking photos, groups of teenagers on school trips, and couples holding hands as they explored the city. Tommy looked around at all these people and felt a sense of opportunity. These weren't locals who knew his reputation. These were strangers who had no idea what they might be dealing with. "Look at all these people," Ben said, clearly excited about whatever Tommy had planned. "This should be fun." Tommy smiled and kept walking. He could feel his friend's eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do next. This was the feeling he lived for. The anticipation, the knowledge that he was in complete control of the situation, and the certainty that whatever happened next, he would come out on top. The afternoon was young, and Tommy was just getting started. He had no idea that, in just a few hours, everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world was about to change forever. For now, though, he was exactly where he wanted to be, walking through London with his friends looking for trouble, and absolutely certain that he was the toughest guy around. As they approached the Westminster area, Tommy's excitement continued to build. He had always enjoyed coming to this part of London because there were so many different types of people around. Tourists from all over the world, business people in expensive suits, and lots of opportunities for entertainment. Tommy cracked his knuckles and kept walking, his friends trailing behind him like a small parade. The day was full of possibilities, and Tommy was ready for whatever came next. Westminster was buzzing with activity as Tommy and his friends made their way through the crowded streets. The area was packed with tourists, all eager to see the famous landmarks they had read about in guidebooks and seen in movies. Street performers were scattered throughout the area, drawing small crowds with their music and magic tricks. The smell of food from various vendors mixed with the sound of dozens of different languages being spoken all around them. Tommy was taking it all in, looking for the perfect opportunity to have some fun. He had done this before many times. The key was finding the right target, someone who looked like they wouldn't fight back, preferably someone with friends or family watching who would make the whole thing more embarrassing for the victim. They walked past Buckingham Palace. Tommy noticed the crowds were particularly thick. Hundreds of people were pressed against the gates, trying to get the perfect photo or hoping to catch a glimpse of something interesting happening inside. Tour guides were holding up colorful umbrellas and flags, trying to keep their groups together in the chaos. "This place is mental," Dave observed, having to raise his voice to be heard over the crowd noise. Tommy nodded, but his attention was focused on something else. Through the crowd, he could see the distinctive red uniform and tall, black hat of a royal guard. The guard was standing perfectly still at his post, completely motionless despite the chaos happening all around him. Now this was interesting. Tommy had heard about these guards before, of course. Everyone knew they were supposed to stand there, like statues no matter what happened around them. He had even seen videos online of tourists trying to make them laugh or react, usually without success, but Tommy had never actually seen one in person. "Look at that," Tommy said to his friends, pointing toward the guard. "Look at this guy just standing there like a robot." Ben immediately perked up. He loved it when Tommy found a new target. "What are you thinking?" he asked, already pulling out his phone to start recording. The guard's name was James, though of course Tommy and his friends had no way of knowing that. James was 25 years old and had been serving as a royal guard for 3 years. Before that, he had completed 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, where he had seen and experienced things that most people could never imagine. Standing guard duty was actually one of the easier parts of James's job, even though it might not look that way to tourists. He had been trained to remain completely still for hours at a time, no matter what was happening around him. He had stood through rain, snow, extreme heat, and countless attempts by tourists to get him to break character. James was aware of the group of young men who had stopped near his post. He had been trained to notice potential threats without moving his eyes or changing his expression. From what he could see in his peripheral vision, they looked like they might be locals rather than tourists. Local troublemakers were often more persistent than tourists when it came to trying to get a reaction. Tommy moved closer to the guard, studying him like he was examining some kind of interesting museum exhibit. The guard was young, probably around Tommy's age, and looked to be in excellent physical condition. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his boots were polished to a mirror shine, and his posture was absolutely perfect. "I bet this guy thinks he's really something special," Tommy said loud enough for the guard to hear, standing there in his fancy costume like he's some kind of soldier. A few tourists nearby turned to look at Tommy, clearly uncomfortable with his tone. Some of them started to move away, sensing that trouble might be brewing. Others, however, seemed curious about what was going to happen next and began pulling out their phones to record. James remained perfectly still. He had heard much worse than this during his time on guard duty. Drunken tourists regularly hurled insults, made jokes about his uniform, and tried various tactics to get him to react. His training had prepared him for all of it. But Tommy was just getting started. "I'm talking to you, mate," Tommy said, stepping even closer. "Don't you think it's rude to ignore someone when they're trying to have a conversation?" Ben was recording everything on his phone, occasionally giggling at Tommy's performance. Dave and Jake were hanging back a bit, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. They had seen Tommy pick on people before, but this felt different somehow. This was a member of the Royal Guard, not just some random person on the street. The crowd around them was growing larger. Word was spreading quickly that something interesting was happening, and people were gathering to watch. Some tourists were taking photos while others were recording videos. A few people in the crowd were making comments about how Tommy should leave the guard alone, but they were speaking quietly and not directly confronting him. Tommy was feeding off the attention, From the crowd, this was exactly what he had been looking for. A captive audience watching him demonstrate his dominance over someone who couldn't fight back. In his mind, this was perfect entertainment. "You know what I think?" Tommy continued, his voice getting louder. "I think you're just playing dress-up. I think underneath that fancy uniform you're just another weak little boy who couldn't handle a real fight." James's training included specific instructions for dealing with verbal harassment. The key was to never react, never engage, and never break character no matter what was said. He had heard every insult imaginable during his time on duty, and none of it affected him anymore. What James was actually thinking about as Tommy continued his verbal assault was his younger sister back home. She was starting university next month, and James was proud of how hard she had worked to get there. He was planning to call her that evening to see how her preparation was going. But Tommy interpreted James's silence as weakness. "Look at him," Tommy said to his friends and the growing crowd. "He can't even defend himself. What kind of man just stands there and takes it when someone's talking to him like this?" An elderly American tourist stepped forward from the crowd. "Excuse me, young man," he said in a polite but firm voice. "I think you should leave this gentleman alone. He's doing his job." Tommy turned toward the tourist with a big grin. "Oh, am I bothering you too, Grandpa? Maybe you want to come over here and make me stop?" The American tourist looked Tommy up and down, clearly evaluating whether he wanted to escalate the situation. After a moment, he shook his head and stepped back into the crowd. He pulled out his phone and appeared to be making a call, probably to the police. Tommy turned his attention back to James, feeling even more confident now that he had successfully intimidated someone else in front of the crowd. "See that?" Tommy said to the guard. "That's what happens when someone actually has some backbone. They speak up for themselves, but you just stand there like a statue because you know you can't handle someone like me." The crowd was getting restless. Some people were clearly enjoying the show, laughing at Tommy's comments and encouraging him to continue. Others looked uncomfortable and were starting to leave the area. A few people were taking photos and videos, obviously planning to share them on social media later. Ben was still recording everything, occasionally making comments like, "This is brilliant," and "You're showing him who's boss, Tommy." Dave finally spoke up. "Maybe we should just leave him alone and find something else to do," he suggested quietly. Tommy shot Dave a look that made it clear this suggestion was not welcome. "We're having a conversation here," Tommy said. "It would be rude to leave before we're finished." James remained motionless, but he was becoming increasingly aware that this situation was escalating beyond normal tourist harassment. He could sense the growing tension in the crowd and could tell from Tommy's body language that the verbal assault might soon become physical. His training included protocols for dealing with physical threats, but James hoped it wouldn't come to that. Physical altercations with civilians always created complications, even when the guard was completely in the right. Tommy was now standing less than 3 feet from James, close enough that he could see the details of the guard's uniform up close. The craftsmanship was impressive, he had to admit. Every button was perfectly placed, every seam was straight, and the fabric looked expensive. "You know what I think your problem is?" Tommy said, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone. "I think you've been told you're special for so long that you actually believe it, but you're not special. You're just another guy in a costume, pretending to be something you're not." Tommy began walking in a circle around James like a predator circling its prey. The crowd followed his movement and more people kept joining to see what was happening. "I bet if I pushed you right now you'd fall over like a domino," Tommy continued. "I bet you've never been in a real fight in your life. All this fancy training and you probably don't even know how to throw a proper punch." James's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign that Tommy's words were having any effect at all. But to Tommy, even this tiny reaction felt like a victory. "Oh, did I hit a nerve?" Tommy asked with a laugh. "Did I say something that bothered you? Well, too bad, because I'm just getting started." The situation was spiraling toward something much more serious than anyone in the crowd had expected when they first stopped to watch. Tommy was completely caught up in the moment, feeding off. The crowd around Tommy and the Royal Guard had grown to over 50 people. What had started as a small gathering of curious tourists had turned into a full-scale spectacle. People were pushing forward to get a better view. Phones were recording, from every angle, and the noise level was rising as more voices joined the conversation. Tommy was absolutely loving every second of it. This was better than any fight he had ever been in, because he had a massive audience and his opponent couldn't fight back. In his mind, this was the perfect situation. All the glory of dominating someone with none of the risk. He continued circling, James like a shark, getting closer with each pass. His friends were still recording everything, though Dave and Jake were looking increasingly worried about where this was heading. Ben, on the other hand, was practically bouncing with excitement, shouting encouragement to Tommy between filming. "Come on, Tommy, show him who runs these streets," Ben called out loud enough for half the crowd to hear. Some tourists in the crowd were becoming uncomfortable with the situation and starting to leave. A few were heard making comments about how someone should call the police, but most people seemed more interested in recording the confrontation than stopping it. Tommy was feeding off the energy of the crowd. Every laugh, every comment of encouragement, every phone pointed in his direction made him feel more powerful. This was his moment to show everyone exactly what kind of man he was. "You know what the funny thing is?" Tommy said to James, now standing directly in front of him again. "All these people are watching you get humiliated by some random bloke from East London, and you can't do anything about it. How does that feel, knowing that everyone here thinks you're a complete joke?" James remained perfectly still, but his mind was working through the situation. He had been trained to handle verbal harassment, and he had experienced much worse than this during his military service. However, he was also trained to recognize when a situation was escalating toward physical violence. Tommy's body language was becoming more aggressive. His fists were clenched, his shoulders were tense, and he was getting closer and closer to James with each comment. The crowd was encouraging him, and James could tell that Tommy was working himself up to do something more than just talk. In his peripheral vision, James could see that several people in the crowd were now on their phones, presumably calling for help. He hoped that police or security would arrive soon, before this situation crossed the line from harassment into assault. But Tommy was past the point of caring about consequences. "I'll tell you what," Tommy announced loudly, making sure everyone in the crowd could hear him. "I'm going to give you one last chance to show everyone that you're actually a man. All you have to do is say something back to me. Just one word, anything at all." Tommy paused dramatically, waiting for a response that he knew wouldn't come. "No? Nothing?" Tommy continued. "Well, then I guess that proves what I've been saying all along. You're nothing but a decoration, a tourist attraction. You're not a real soldier, and you're definitely not a real man." The crowd was getting restless. Some people were clearly hoping to see things escalate further, while others were becoming uncomfortable with Tommy's increasingly aggressive behavior. A few tourists were heard discussing whether they should intervene, but most seemed content to watch and record. Tommy stepped even closer to James, now close enough that he was almost touching him. "Last chance," he said in a quieter voice that was somehow more menacing than his previous shouting. "Defend yourself, or I'm going to show everyone here exactly how weak you really are." James could smell the alcohol on Tommy's breath and could see the anger in his eyes. Every instinct from his military training was telling him that physical contact was imminent. But his orders were clear. He was not to move, speak, or react unless he was in immediate physical danger. Tommy took James's continued silence as confirmation of everything he had been saying. In his alcohol-fueled confidence, he interpreted, "The guard's discipline as cowardice. That's what I thought," Tommy said with a sneer. "You're pathetic." And then in a moment that would change everything, Tommy made the decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. Without any further warning, Tommy pulled back his right arm and threw a full-power punch directly at James's face. Time seemed to slow down as Tommy's fist moved through the air. The crowd gasped collectively, phones continued recording, and Tommy felt a surge of satisfaction as he anticipated the moment his punch would connect. This was it. This was his moment of complete triumph. He was about to knock out a member of the Royal Guard in front of dozens of witnesses, and the whole thing was being recorded for posterity. In Tommy's mind, this would be the story that would cement his reputation forever. The punch was well aimed and thrown with all of Tommy's considerable strength. He had been in enough fights to know how to throw a proper haymaker, and he put everything he had behind this one. In his experience, a punch like this was enough to drop almost anyone. But Tommy had made several critical miscalculations. First, he had assumed that James was just a ceremonial guard with no real combat training. This assumption was completely wrong. James was a highly trained soldier who had seen combat in Afghanistan and had received extensive hand-to-hand combat training as part of his military service. Second, Tommy had assumed that James's stillness and silence meant he was passive and unprepared for violence. This was also wrong. James had been aware of the escalating threat for several minutes and had been mentally preparing for the possibility of physical confrontation. Third, and most importantly, Tommy had assumed that because James hadn't been reacting to verbal harassment, he wouldn't be able to react quickly to physical assault. This was perhaps the most dangerous assumption of all. As Tommy's punch flew toward his face, James's training kicked in automatically. Years of military combat instruction and countless hours of practice had prepared him for exactly this moment. The transformation was instantaneous and shocking. 1 second, James was standing perfectly still like a statue. The next second, he was moving with the speed and precision of a trained warrior. James saw the punch coming long before it reached him. Tommy's technique was sloppy, his approach was telegraphed, and his balance was compromised by alcohol and overconfidence. To someone with James's training, Tommy might as well have announced his intention to throw the punch several seconds in advance. James shifted his weight slightly, turning his head just enough to let Tommy's fist pass harmlessly by his face. The punch missed by less than an inch, but it might as well have missed by a mile. Tommy's eyes widened in shock as he realized his punch had connected with nothing but air. His momentum carried him forward, completely off balance, directly into James's defensive response. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds contained more action than most people see in their entire lives. As Tommy's missed punch carried him forward, James grabbed Tommy's extended arm with both hands. Using Tommy's own momentum against him, James executed a perfect defensive throw that he had practiced thousands of times during his military training. Tommy found himself flying through the air, completely helpless, with no idea how he had gotten there or where he was going to land. The confident sneer on his face was replaced by an expression of complete shock and confusion. The crowd erupted in gasps, shouts, and screams as they watched Tommy's body rotate through the air before crashing down onto the pavement with a sound that could be heard over all the noise from the surrounding crowd. Tommy hit the ground hard, landing on his back with his right arm twisted underneath him. The impact knocked the wind out of his lungs and sent a shock of pain through his entire body. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and couldn't even process what had just happened to him. James, meanwhile, had returned to his original position and was once again standing at perfect attention, as if nothing had happened at all. The entire sequence, from Tommy's missed punch to his impact with the ground, had taken less time than it takes most people to blink. The crowd was in complete chaos. People were shouting, cameras were flashing, and everyone was trying to get a better view of Tommy lying on the ground. Ben had dropped his phone in shock and was staring at his friend with his mouth hanging open. Dave and Jake were pushing through the crowd, trying to reach Tommy to see if he was seriously injured. Tommy lay on the pavement staring up at the sky, trying to figure out what had just happened to him. One moment he had been in complete control of the situation, dominating someone who couldn't fight back. The next moment, he was flat on his back, in pain, and completely humiliated in front of dozens of strangers. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Tommy realized that everything he thought he knew about himself, about fighting, and about being tough had just been shattered in less than 3 seconds. The silence that followed Tommy's impact with the pavement lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The entire crowd seemed frozen in shock, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Dozens of phones were still recording, capturing every moment of Tommy's humiliation for posterity. Tommy himself was still lying on the ground, gasping for air and trying to understand what had happened. The confident, aggressive young man who had been dominating the situation just moments before was now flat on his back, completely helpless and thoroughly confused. James remained perfectly still in his guard position, showing no sign that anything unusual had occurred. His breathing was steady, his posture was perfect, and his expression remained completely neutral. To anyone who hadn't witnessed the previous few seconds, it would appear that he had been standing motionless the entire time. But the crowd had seen everything, and they were not about to let this moment pass quietly. "Did you see that?" Someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "He didn't even move," another voice called out. The guard took him down without breaking a sweat. The comments were coming from all directions now, as people tried to describe what they had witnessed to friends who were still arriving at the scene. The story was already changing as it spread through the crowd, with each telling making James's defensive move sound more impressive and Tommy's defeat more complete. Ben finally found his voice and rushed over to where Tommy was lying. "Tommy! Tommy, are you all right?" he asked, kneeling down beside his friend. Tommy tried to sit up but immediately regretted the decision as pain shot through his back and right arm. What happened?" he managed to say, though his voice was weak and confused. "You got dropped, mate," Dave said as he and Jake pushed through the crowd to reach their friend. "That guard just destroyed you." Tommy's eyes widened as the memory came flooding back. He remembered throwing the punch. He remembered the confidence he had felt as his fist moved toward the guard's face. And then, nothing. The next thing he knew, he was on the ground. "Help me up," Tommy said, trying to maintain some dignity despite the circumstances. His friends helped him to his feet, but it was immediately obvious that he was hurt. His right arm was hanging at an odd angle and he was clearly in considerable pain. His clothes were dirty from the pavement, and there was a small cut on his forehead from where he had hit the ground. But perhaps more damaging than his physical injuries was what had happened to his reputation. The man who had built his entire identity around being tough and intimidating had just been effortlessly defeated by someone who never even changed his expression. The crowd was becoming more vocal now, with people openly commenting on what had happened. "Serves him right for picking on someone just doing their job," an elderly woman said loudly. That guard showed incredible restraint, a man with an American accent observed. "He could have done much worse." "I hope someone got that on video," a teenager said, holding up his phone. "This is going to go viral." Tommy heard all of these comments, and each one felt like another blow to his ego. These strangers were talking about him like he was some kind of joke, some entertainment for their amusement. The man who had always been feared and respected was now being laughed at by tourists. But Tommy's humiliation was far from over. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder as they approached. Someone in the crowd had obviously called the police, and they were now rushing to the scene. "We need to get out of here," Jake said urgently. "The police are coming." Tommy tried to walk normally, but his injuries made it difficult. Every step sent pain through his body, and his right arm was clearly injured more seriously than he had initially thought. "I can't walk fast," Tommy admitted reluctantly. "Something's wrong with my arm." Dave and Jake looked at each other with concern. They had all been in situations with the police before, and they knew that running away would only make things worse. But they also knew that Tommy was facing serious charges if he was arrested for assaulting a royal guard. Before they could make a decision about what to do, 3 police officers appeared through the crowd, moving quickly toward the scene. They had clearly been briefed about the situation because they knew exactly who they were looking for. "You," one of the officers said, pointing directly at Tommy. "Stay right where you are." Tommy considered trying to run, but in his current condition, he knew he wouldn't get very far. Besides, there were still dozens of people around recording everything, and attempting to flee would only make him look more guilty. The lead police officer was a woman in her 30s who clearly had experience dealing with situations like this. She approached Tommy calmly but firmly, keeping her hand near her radio in case she needed to call for backup. "Sir, I need you to put your hands behind your back," she instructed. "I think my arm is broken," Tommy said, wincing as he tried to move his right arm. The officer examined Tommy's arm briefly and could see that he was indeed injured. "We'll get you medical attention," she said. "But first you're under arrest for assault on a public official." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Tommy felt his world collapsing around him. This was supposed to have been a fun afternoon of showing off for his friends and intimidating some tourist or local. Instead, he was being arrested in front of dozens of witnesses, many of whom were still recording everything on their phones. The second police officer was already talking to witnesses, gathering statements about what had happened. The stories were remarkably consistent. Everyone described Tommy as the aggressor who had thrown the first punch, and everyone praised the guard for his restraint and professionalism. The young man was harassing the guard for several minutes, one witness explained. The guard never moved or said anything even when this fellow was right in his face shouting insults. He threw a punch at the guard's head, another witness added. But the guard just stepped aside and used the attacker's own momentum against him. It was like something out of a martial arts movie. The guard showed incredible discipline, a third witness observed. He could have seriously hurt that young man, but he only did what was necessary to defend himself. Each statement made Tommy's situation worse. There was no question about who had been the aggressor, no ambiguity about who had thrown the first punch, and no doubt about the fact that James had only acted in self-defense. The third police officer was speaking with James, who was still maintaining his guard position, despite everything that had happened around him. "Are you injured, sir?" the officer asked quietly. "No, sir," James replied without moving his lips or changing his expression. "Do you need medical attention?" "No, sir." "Will you be able to continue your duties?" "Yes, sir." The entire conversation took less than 30 seconds and James never moved a muscle. His professionalism and discipline were obvious to everyone watching, creating an even starker contrast with Tommy's behavior. Meanwhile, Tommy was being loaded into an ambulance for treatment of his injuries. The paramedics confirmed that his right arm was indeed broken, and he would need to go to the hospital for x-rays and proper medical care. As the ambulance doors closed, Tommy could see the crowd through the small window. People were still talking about what had happened, still recording videos and still pointing in his direction. His friends were standing nearby, looking shocked and unsure about what to do next. Ben was staring at his phone, watching the video he had recorded of the entire incident. The footage clearly showed Tommy being the aggressor, throwing the first punch and then being effortlessly defeated by the guard. Ben realized that this video, which he had originally planned to post online as evidence of Tommy's toughness, was now a permanent record of his friend's most humiliating moment. Dave and Jake were discussing what they should do next. They knew they would probably be called as witnesses in any legal proceedings that followed, and they were worried about being associated with Tommy's actions. "This is bad," Dave said quietly. "This is really, really bad." Jake nodded. "He assaulted a royal guard in front of 50 witnesses. There's no way he's getting out of this one." As the ambulance pulled away from the scene, taking Tommy to the hospital and then inevitably to jail, the crowd began to disperse. People were already sharing their videos on social media, uploading photos and telling the story to friends and family. James remained at his post, continuing his guard duty as if nothing had happened. His training and professionalism had been tested under extreme circumstances, and he had passed with flying colors. He had defended himself when necessary, used minimal force, and maintained his composure throughout the entire ordeal. For Tommy, however, the nightmare was just beginning. He was facing serious criminal charges, significant medical bills, and the complete destruction of his reputation. The man who had always been known as the toughest guy in his neighborhood was now known as the fool who got knocked down by a guard, who never even broke a sweat. And thanks to the dozens of people who had recorded the incident, this humiliation would be preserved forever on the internet for the whole world to see. Within 6 hours of Tommy's humiliating defeat, the first video of the incident had been uploaded to social media. Ben, despite his loyalty to his friend, had been unable to resist the temptation to share what he considered to be an incredible piece of footage. He posted it with the caption, "My mate tried to mess with a royal guard. You won't believe what happened next." The video spread like wildfire across the internet. By the next morning, the footage had been viewed over 100,000 times across various platforms. People were sharing it, commenting on it, and creating their own reaction videos. The story was being picked up by news outlets, bloggers, and social media influencers around the world. Tommy, meanwhile, was sitting in a hospital bed with his right arm in a cast, waiting to be formally charged by the police. The doctor had confirmed that he had suffered a clean break in his forearm, which would require several weeks to heal properly. But his physical injuries were nothing compared to the damage that was being done to his reputation online. The videos of the incident had been posted from multiple angles, giving viewers a complete picture of what had happened. There was no ambiguity about who had been the aggressor, no question about who had thrown the first punch, and no doubt about the spectacular nature of Tommy's defeat. The comments on the videos were brutal. "This is what happens when you mess with someone who actually knows how to fight," one person wrote. "The guard didn't even break a sweat," another commented. "Professional versus amateur. I love how the guard just went back to standing perfectly still like nothing happened," someone else observed. "This guy thought he was tough until he met someone who was actually trained for combat," read another comment. Each comment felt like a personal attack on Tommy's character and reputation. He had spent years building an image of himself as someone to be feared and respected, and now that image was being destroyed by strangers on the internet who saw him as nothing more than entertainment. But the online humiliation was just the beginning of Tommy's problems. 3 days after the incident, he was formally charged with assault on a public official, disorderly conduct, and disturbing the peace. His lawyer explained that these were serious charges that could result in significant jail time, especially given the high-profile nature of the victim and the public way in which the assault had been carried out. "The fact that this was recorded and widely shared actually works against you," his lawyer explained during their first meeting. "The Crown Prosecution Service has dozens of witnesses and multiple video recordings showing you as the clear aggressor. This is not a case we can win by claiming self-defense or arguing about what really happened." Tommy's lawyer was a public defender who had seen many cases like this before. Though few had received quite as much public attention, he explained that Tommy's best option would be to plead guilty and hope for leniency from the judge. "Your best-case scenario is probably a suspended sentence with community service and a significant fine," the lawyer continued. "But given the serious nature of the charges and the public interest in this case, I wouldn't rule out actual jail time." Tommy couldn't believe what he was hearing. A few days ago, he had been the king of his neighborhood, feared and respected by everyone who knew him. Now he was facing the possibility of going to prison for what he had thought would be a bit of harmless fun with a tourist attraction. Meanwhile, the internet had moved on from simply sharing the original videos to creating elaborate memes and parodies based on Tommy's defeat. Someone had created a slow-motion analysis of the incident, breaking down exactly how James had used Tommy's own momentum against him. Another video compared Tommy's failed punch to famous knockout scenes from movies, highlighting just how poorly he had performed compared to fictional tough guys. The most popular meme showed a before and after comparison. Tommy looking confident and aggressive in the moments before his attack, followed by him lying flat on his back on the pavement. The caption read, "How it started versus how it ended." These memes were being shared thousands of times per day, ensuring that Tommy's humiliation reached an even wider audience than the original videos. Back in Tommy's neighborhood, the reaction was mixed. Some of his old associates were distancing themselves from him, not wanting to be associated with someone who had become a laughingstock. Others were expressing sympathy, arguing that anyone could have a bad day and that Tommy was being unfairly persecuted by the internet mob. But the general consensus was that Tommy's reputation as the toughest guy around had been permanently destroyed. Kids who used to cross the street to avoid him were now pointing and laughing when they saw him. Adults who had once shown him fearful respect were now making jokes about the incident. Dave and Jake had been called as witnesses for the prosecution and had reluctantly agreed to testify about what they had seen. They both felt terrible about having to speak against their friend in court, but they also couldn't lie under oath about what had happened. "I've known Tommy for 15 years, Dave explained to the prosecutor during his witness preparation. "I've seen him in a lot of fights and he's usually pretty good at handling himself. But this was different. The guard wasn't some drunk bloke outside a pub. This was a trained soldier, and Tommy had no idea what he was getting himself into." Ben, who had originally recorded and shared the video, was now facing his own consequences. His decision to post the footage had resulted in a flood of attention that he wasn't prepared for. Reporters were calling him for interviews, people were recognizing him on the street, and he was receiving both praise and criticism for his role in making the incident public. "I didn't think it would blow up like this," Ben explained to a local news reporter. "I just thought it was an interesting video that my friends might like to see. I had no idea it would end up on the news around the world." But perhaps the most surprising development was what was happening to James, the Royal Guard who had been the target of Tommy's assault. James had been quietly commended by his superiors for his handling of the situation. His restraint, professionalism, and precise defensive response had been exactly what his training had prepared him for. He had neutralized a threat without escalating the situation unnecessarily, and he had maintained his composure throughout the entire ordeal. However, James himself was somewhat uncomfortable with the attention the incident had brought him. He had never sought fame or recognition. He was simply doing his job the way he had been trained to do it. The fact that his actions were being celebrated online and in the media felt strange to someone who valued discipline and anonymity. "I was just following my training," James told his commanding officer when asked about the incident. "Anyone in my position would have done the same thing," but his commanding officer disagreed. "Not everyone would have shown the restraint you showed," he replied. "You could have seriously injured that young man, but you used exactly the amount of force necessary to defend yourself and no more. That takes considerable skill and judgment." As the weeks passed, the legal proceedings against Tommy moved forward. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his lawyer's advice proved to be accurate. Tommy eventually pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a suspended 6-month jail sentence, 200 hours of community service, and a $2,000 fine. The judge's comments during sentencing were particularly harsh. "Mr. Thompson," the judge said, using Tommy's last name formally, "your actions that day were not only criminal but deeply disrespectful to a member of our armed forces who was simply doing his duty. You assaulted someone who could not defend himself in the normal way due to his professional obligations, and you did so in front of children and families who were simply trying to enjoy a day out in our capital city." The judge continued, "The fact that your actions were recorded and shared widely on social media serves as a powerful reminder that our behavior in public spaces is no longer private. Your few seconds of poor judgment will follow you for the rest of your life. And I hope that serves as a lesson not only to you, but to others who might consider similar actions." The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious observers, many of whom had been following the case since the original videos went viral. Tommy's sentencing was covered by major news outlets, ensuring that his legal consequences received almost as much attention as his original defeat. For Tommy, the months that followed were among the most difficult of his life. His community service involved cleaning up public spaces around London, often in areas where tourists might recognize him from the viral videos. His construction job had let him go while he was dealing with his legal troubles, and finding new employment proved challenging when potential employers could easily find videos of his assault and arrest with a simple internet search. The $2,000 fine, combined with his legal fees and lost income, created serious financial problems. Tommy had never been good with money to begin with, and the unexpected expenses pushed him into debt that would take years to pay off. But perhaps most difficult of all was the complete transformation of his social status. The man who had once been feared and respected was now seen as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence and poor judgment. Children who had once avoided him now felt comfortable mocking him to his face.